Much. Our next presentation will be a fireside chat hosted by our very own Bill Antholis, the man, the myth, the legend, the director and the CEO of the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, and featuring Ms. Brigid J. Ryan, the director of Southern Europe and the South Caucasus of the National Security Council. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Antholis and Ms. Ryan.
Mr. Ambassador, it's really great to be here. I'm really delighted to be with Brigid. So thank you so much for spending the time with us and giving an overview of how the U.S. government is thinking about Cyprus in a region that's been in a little bit of turmoil lately, right? So the last year plus has taken a region that was already a tinderbox and set it on fire in a sense. And in the last year plus, we've had elections in Greece, in Turkey, and in Cyprus. And given all of those things, we have a strategic dialogue now between the United States and Cyprus, the first time ever. So I just wonder if you'd give us a sense of the trajectory of that and some of the key points that are going on there and how and why now and where you see things headed.
Okay, thanks for that, Bill, and I'm using this microphone, so can everyone hear me? I guess I'd like to start this conversation actually by backing things up a little bit with my own story of how I came to work on Cyprus, because my area of studies here from the teacher from the Foreign Service Institute is in the audience. And so about a decade ago, I'm at the National Security Council, detailed from the State Department. I'm a Foreign Service officer by training. And about a decade ago, I was posted in Istanbul, Turkey, where I covered the rights of religious minorities, worked heavily and very closely with the Ecumenical Patriarch, and then from 2017 to 2020 was posted in Athens. So ahead of that tour, I learned Greek and then worked very closely with the Greek government covering domestic politics. And so I long joked that the one country that was remaining elusive was the opportunity to work on Cyprus. So when the former senior director for the European Directorate at the National Security Council, Amanda Sloat, asked me to join her team in July 2023, I was thrilled that I finally had the chance to work on the Cyprus issue. So from a personal perspective, it was a real pleasure to come into this file, which is fraught with a complicated history and full of complicated geopolitical problems in, as you noted, a difficult neighborhood in the world. But I felt like one advantage of, at the time it was 49 years of a divided island and of a complicated foreign policy directed towards Cyprus, but I felt like I had two things working for me. One is that I was going to go work for a president who's affectionately known as Joe Bidenopoulos and who had visited Cyprus, is committed to the island, and also that there was a lot of opportunity for growth in the relationship because Cyprus has been hamstrung both by the division of the island but also by some foreign policy restrictions, and here I refer to the international trafficking in arms restrictions and other limitations on what we could do in our bilateral relationship. It felt like a real opportunity to take a different approach, and that's sort of what we've done throughout the last year and a half. But really before that, I should note that Secretary Pompeo in 2019 signed the Statement of Intent to conduct bilateral defense consultations, which helped pave the way for increasing and improving, I think, our bilateral relationship with Cyprus. So since then, I'd say we've really hit the gas. As you rightly noted, we held the first strategic dialogue this fall in Nicosia, hosted by Assistant Secretary Jim O'Brien. We've also, for 2 years running, lifted or waived the ITAR restrictions, which enable us to do more in terms of defense cooperation with Cyprus. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but stay tuned. There's maybe more to come on that front. And we are very close. We're looking at Cyprus as a visa waiver country. I think numbers look good, so let's see how that goes, but that's also something I expect to see done relatively quickly. And so I'd say we say this about a lot of countries, we say we're at a high point in the bilateral relationship, but in the case of Cyprus, it's really true. We're in new terrain here with Cyprus, and that was capped by President Christodoulides' recent visit to the White House, and I had the pleasure of participating in that meeting. And I can say that President Biden and President Christodoulides have terrific personal rapport. They've known each other obviously more than a decade because Christodoulides was in Cyprus when President Biden visited as vice president. And it was a real pleasure to be able to have that Oval Office meeting during this president's outgoing months. I think it meant a lot to both leaders to connect on that level. I was pleased to see President Christodoulides speaking on behalf of Cyprus, but also on behalf of Europe. I mean, he raised a whole host of issues, and you rightly note some of the geostrategic issues in that corner of the Eastern Med. And so, I mean, I feel like the relationship has really matured. Some of that is driven by, like I said, there was a lot of space to grow. There's an inclination, certainly in this administration, which I think is really a bipartisan inclination. But some of it was driven, sadly, by the events of October 2023. After Hamas's brutal attack on Israel, that was a game changer for the security situation in the Eastern Med. The United States we did evacuate some Americans out of Israel, and Cyprus played a role in helping get those folks to safety. And then we had to do planning for potential evacuations from other areas in the region, and Cyprus has generally hosted U.S. planners for that purpose. And then, of course, offered to do the Amalthea corridor, the maritime humanitarian corridor, which, again, when the plan was first put together, it looked like a shot in the dark, and then lo and behold, President Biden is mentioning it in the State Department, in the State of the Union, and I'm on the ground in Cyprus trying to implement it. So it's been kind of a wild ride for a little island, but hats off to the team from President Christodoulides on down that have been really leveraging their strategic advantage by virtue of location, but also willingness and aptitude to it's sort of like a disruptor in foreign policy in a good way, though, but to take what can be seen as a historic problem and leverage it into an asset.
All really helpful, including your personal background, and a great reminder that we have these, as this documentary did a terrific job of, we have these abstract concepts like strategic dialogues, but it's really real live people that engage for reasons of not just national interest, but personal interest and commitment. Tell me a little bit more about the strategic dialogue on some of the details and how it plays out, and including, we're in the middle of the beginning of a transition. The transition will continue. Career folks will typically stay in for a while until the new team sorts out who does what. And so tell me how you see that moving forward. Because particularly the commitment and interest on the Cypriot side is just as important as the interest of career people who will explain to the incoming folks, this is why we're doing this, this is the value of the proposition, this is why we should remain engaged in this, or if we don't, these are the other options.
Yep. Well, a strategic dialogue is really a framework for having formal bilateral consultations between two governments at a pretty sophisticated level. So while an Oval Office meeting is, obviously it's a sign of the status of the bilateral relationship, and it is a warm and important diplomatic event, and nothing can replace the contact between heads of state. But that is a more celebratory, formal kind of occasion, whereas the strategic dialogue is like the less sexy event, if I may. It's where bureaucrats such as myself, I did not participate in the strategic dialogue in Nicosia, but I helped plan a lot of it. But it's the kind of unsexy but extraordinarily important work of doing the nation's business on both sides of the aisle. So typically these cover a range of areas of cooperation: energy, economics, people-to-people, security and defense. Sometimes there's a particular cultural touch point. In this case, Cyprus signed the Artemis Accords, so we had a space angle.
Mm-hmm.
But this is like in-depth conversations that are the culmination of the work, usually of working groups who are tasked with specific sets of work plans, and then we review them at the strategic dialogue, and then we launch the agenda for the next year in preparation for the next strategic dialogue. So it's it's intended to be an episodic event, typically annually, and often we host them, in Washington and then in our host country's capital. But it's not intended to be like a one-off event. It's not intended to be political in nature. It's intended to really be an opportunity to deal with our core foreign policy issues. So I take it as a very good sign that we held the first strategic dialogue with Cyprus because, it sets the way for future ones, which helps isolate the relationship or protect the relationship from political whims.
So whether or not it's a political whim, obviously one of the big challenges that remains in Cyprus is the division of the island and trying to find a pathway forward to resolve a 50-year-old conflict. President Christodoulidis just met with President Erdogan. There appears to be at least the glimmer of a hope of more conversations there. How does the U.S.-Cyprus relationship relate to those conversations and the prospect of trying to drive forward toward a solution?
I think we have tried to support dialogue in whatever format it takes, whether it's formal or unstructured, as is the case of the recent conversation between Christodoulidis and Erdogan. I think, and I see Ambassador Nasika here, so I'll mention Greece. I think Greece's recent warming of relations with Turkey helps set good conditions to talk about the Cyprus issues, though I recognize that Prime Minister Mitsotakis and President Erdogan have not put that at the front and center of their bilateral relationship, and I think that's wise. I think an issue like, when you're approaching 50 years of a divided island, I think you have to help set conditions to try to move forward with confidence-building measures that can lead to a discussion, but you have to not force the issue and you have to let parties come to it naturally while doing all that you can to set them in the best position possible. So I think our recent, I'll say upgrade and uptick in our relationship with the Republic of Cyprus helps also set some of those conditions that can foster more dialogue and that can lead to confidence-building measures. I don't think that the UN Secretary General's personal envoy's recent report wasn't overly optimistic, but it also wasn't catastrophic. So, there's an opportunity. I was talking last night with a friend who I don't know if he's in the room, so I definitely won't name him, but he told me, Brigid, what's the best, we're looking at the 50-year anniversary, what's the best predictor of future behavior, past behavior? And I said that I disagreed with that. I think the best predictor of future behavior is interests. So we have to look at what is in each party's interest as they move forward and finding ways to, where interests may not naturally exist, to incentivize some of that.
So obviously the big U.S. interests in the region are the conflicts going on in Israel and Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah, the other neighboring countries, potentially Iran. Already live fire. How does, you mentioned before that Cyprus can play into that, possibly in a constructive way? How does that work? But also, does the conflict make it harder to keep the U.S. interest focused and sustained on trying to encourage things along in Cyprus?
Well, I can say that Cyprus has already proven that it can play a constructive role. A few months after Hamas's brutal attack, Cyprus was coming up with, a solution to an urgent pressing need, which was the lack of humanitarian access. At the time, we were not sending ships to Ashdod port even. We were doing only land routes, which are the way that most aid gets into Gaza, but we were in desperate need of maximizing our foreign assistance to Gaza. And the president was very clear that he wanted to use all available means to increase humanitarian assistance. And, Cyprus came up with a novel solution, which we were able to partner with the Department of Defense to build this temporary pier, which in its short life delivered more than 800,000 cubic tons of humanitarian assistance, which is no small feat. And significantly, it's also that maritime corridor that then led to the delivery of aid through Ashdod port in Israel, which had not been open prior to that. So it had a very positive knock-on effect. It led to a lot of discussions between the Republic of Cyprus and Israel about the delivery, about deconflicting, about screening, using our Cyclops Center that we co-lead with Cyprus, where they have trained. I mean, this is really an amazing center. I don't think most Americans know much about it, but on the island of Cyprus, there is a facility where they screen cargo, and they're the most enthusiastic screeners I've ever met. And I see Brian Arduni in the back there, and I think about the ability to use screening on I also cover Armenia and Azerbaijan, on some of the other issues I work on, the value of cargo screening and this level of expertise which exists on the island of Cyprus. They were able to put that to use and work carefully with our DoD planners to launch this maritime corridor in a matter of weeks. It was an impressive feat. And since then, in terms of the after effect of I think we can say that the situation between Israel and Hamas has heightened U.S. attention on the East Med in a way that I don't see changing anytime soon. So again, while it's under sad circumstances, the attention is there, and we're not going to turn away from it. It's also brought Cyprus and Israel much closer. We have this 3+1 format, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, with the United States. But the need to work out the humanitarian corridor has brought these two countries much closer together. In terms of, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned as we work through the future of Gaza. I mean, there are a lot of questions for the next day. Who's going to help with reconstruction? Who's going to help with security? How do you deal with talk about a long-standing problem of an isolated piece of land? We just watched a movie about Varosha. I mean, there are some lessons learned that could be applicable across other conflicts around the world. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on this space.
So I'll ask one last question and then open it up to the audience for questions. Talk, if you could, a little bit about energy and how it both fits into the strategic dialogue, but even more broadly. And there's obviously the interest in seabed hydrocarbons, but also the importance of shipping in the region. Cyprus as as an island of stability in a hostile region, or a region with hostilities, but particularly for shipping and sea lanes and the like. So, if you could.
Yeah, I think, on the energy question, Chevron is actively working in Cyprus, and I think we've gotten to a good place on that arrangement. We are looking at things like the Great Sea Interconnector, the need to diversify the energy grid, connect Cyprus, connect it through Greece. And those, I'll leave it to those, I should really leave it to Ambassador Nasik and Ambassador Saba to discuss where their countries sit on that. But those are real opportunities that have moved along, I think, at a relatively rapid rate, given what look like some geostrategic challenges. I know that there were some questions about, a Turkish vessel a couple of months ago, and that's one of those instances that, were the relationship between Greece and Turkey in a different place, that could have proved to be a real diplomatic nightmare and business nightmare. And instead, it was resolved through dialogue, which I think is important to take stock of where we are. We're not in a place where this both countries spin up their armies and this turns into like a hot incident. Instead, we're able to de-escalate quickly, which presents better commercial opportunities on the energy side, but generally for shipping lanes and for anyone trying to do trade in the region. I think that stronger relationship between Mitsotakis and Erdogan, between their foreign ministers, and then with Cyprus playing a constructive role, I see the future. If we can hold where we are, we're in a pretty good place.
Really great. Thank you.